Well, I'm aware that in some places, in the different streams that we're going out in different places, Podbeam and Facebook and such like, there was a bit of silence there. That's okay. We're working with simple technology here to make it simple for everybody. Hi Ray, we've got the 444 now. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm still in the midst of a lot of housekeeping.
Well, that's how it is. Maybe the 444 today will just be a lot of silence. That's perfectly fine. We've had, we've had times where we just sit and think and don't speak.
Yeah, well, I've got two baked potatoes to eat at some point in the next 10 minutes, so I'm hoping somebody else comes in and wants to be a bit chatty.
Yeah. Do you know what? Just don't worry about it. If all we describe today is that the 444 is a place that nobody tells you to say anything or text anything, and you can just hang out, then I think that's good enough, really.
Yeah, I was kind of casually looking at a very old TV show about the Domesday Book. Michael Woods, that historian, and from the mid-80s, and he was mentioning that, back then, 1086 or whatever, England and Wales was largely woodland, and so it was fully banditry and this and that, but it was largely, even pre-Norman conquest, royally owned. So you could be persecuted for being in there. So you can imagine the hypervigilance that was going on in those spaces. What I think I'm trying to say is that this little space that we're opening up here on Sundays for about an hour is a bit like the wild woodlands of England and Wales in Norman times.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the metaphor. Um, I kind of think of it like the coffee shops of London. I don't know which century they became the places, but in the coffee shops of London, you got political parties created, you got socialist ideas created, and you also got the City of London designed and created.
Yeah, Lloyd's coffee shops was, I think, the originals. The finance service, insurance. Yeah. Oh, there you are. It's the means of connection, the way people connect. I used to visit a friend of mine in the local library because it had a vending machine that had quite nice hot chocolate. And so he used to be sitting round the table where all the newspapers were. And I think I've told this story before, perhaps. And just used to arrive there and sit round the news table with a cheap 10p hot chocolate. And we used to call it the den of iniquity, was it? No, sedition. The den of yeah. It was this idea of sedition, of like misusing a public space, or piggybacking. We used to call it.
Do you know, if you romanticize the 444 drop-in to being a den of sedition, a place where ideas get fermented, um, I just think that's a lovely concept.
Well,
I
behind
just,
all
yeah.
that, well, behind all that, even is the idea that it's a space of possibilities.
Okay, flight of fantasy then. Um, the conspirators. What do we want to create? Conspirators are normally about building something or tearing something down.
Those are like the two polarities, aren't they, of the autistic experience sometimes. You know, if I can't participate, I shall destroy. Um, Maybe a bit extreme there, but yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there is a bit of that about the autistic experience, but I don't think it's part of the autism. I think it's part of being a pushed around minority that makes it like that. Um, an awful lot of what we are even teaching ourselves about autism is actually the position that autistic people are put in by society, and then their experience within society then creates the behaviours and the stereotypes that then they use to diagnose us. Um, I'm looking forward to editing what I just said there, and when there's a bit of text there, I think I might have said something I'll cut and paste and put somewhere.
I was kind of obsessed this morning with this. You know, I journal every morning, think things through, and I was obsessed with this idea that a lot of what we think is inherited, um, conditioned. So even the way we try and analyze or understand things is a given. It's been given to us, the process. And that indicates to me that there may be a way of understanding that isn't that. So getting into that space, you know, it's kind of my MO currently.
Hello. I'm just thinking about what Raymond was talking about, and it's sent a few little tangents off in my brain. So I was thinking earlier about evidence and the different kinds of evidence that can exist in the world, and then the kinds that we've learnt to esteem. Um, and I remember really enjoying learning a little bit about the process of like qualitative research, where you're working with story and you're working with the way that people construct meaning. Um, but then there was something else that you said there about. I'm going to go a wee bit slowly on this, but
The inherited meaning or
yes, the inherited. Yeah, I think that
understanding.
there's
Yeah.
so. Yes, there's. I was thinking about all the It's almost like little programs that we run that can be questions. Like I was reading, I wanted to understand something today, so I looked up something about. I was reading an assignment about autistic women's reading an essay about autistic women's well-being, and talked about like the burden of families and society. A way to frame something that you could so easily flip and say, um, within a society that does not accommodate like the entirety of the human experience, and that marginalizes parts, huge parts of society based on not on like a strange measure, but instead to sort of say that to say that people were a burden. It just seemed like such a loaded statement that seemed really unexamined in that piece of work. And I think there was something else you said, and my brain got really happy about it. And oh, but it was like, I think it was you were talking about the programmed ways of thinking, but I think that the difficulty is how heavily policed, for want of a better word, um, it can be when you start using different ways of perception or thinking or um, I've had I remember at school, um, I remember at school a kid like try to copy my work, but telling me my work was wrong when my work was right. It was math, so it was easy to tell if it was right or wrong. And she, that's not right. And then it was right, but because she couldn't understand it, she couldn't see the correctness like of in the first place. And I've noticed that it can be really surprised, not quite a yes. Um, that I get subjected to if my thinking isn't understood by a person, rather than being able to say, I don't understand, they say that, oh, you're crazy. And I think that that really keeps us in programs, or at least speak.
Yeah, Nicola, it's like you've fully broken up there, your internet connection. We aren't hearing anything. We heard a lot of what you said there. It's just like in the last 5, 10 seconds, it's went silent. But of course, we'll take notes on all the keywords that trigger our understanding here and better ways of understanding.
The thing I liked about what Nicola was just saying was the end bit where she was explained it in that simpler way, that somebody copied her work that they didn't understand, and thought it was wrong, and rather than accept from Nicola an explanation of the maths, the person would just go away with the idea that it was wrong and choose to just accept that rather than admitting their inability to understand. So it comes down in the end to a lot of society's rules are, if you don't understand it, deny it's true.
Hi, yeah, I just popped back in the last few seconds there, and I caught the tail end of what you were saying. And I just also wanted to say that even me saying these things, I notice that I'm feeling internally pleased by saying, oh, is that not an arrogant thing to say? Like, if other people aren't understanding you, maybe you're just not making any sense, you know? Um, and I know that that communication's a two-way process,
I
but
just want to
it's,
laugh in the background. I
oh,
just want there to be a background of laughter as you're
thank
speaking,
you.
because just so you don't feel that you're out there on your own saying this
Just
thing into the
crescendo.
void.
Yeah, I know. It's like the people, who is this horrible woman?
Welcome to the void.
I love that you said that, Nicola, because I am damn sure that Raymond experiences it and I experience it. That
Hmm.
You know, yes.
Honestly, do you want to hear my theory?
Go on,
Would
go
you
on.
like to hear my theory? So my theory is that it comes from the witch wound. I feel that we, and it was men and women who were accused and who were sentenced and who were killed, brutally killed, not that many generations ago, with just our kind of traits of speaking differently, of acting differently, of stimming, and I do think it's almost like a what's it called? When it what's it called when there's a trauma in the DNA, like inherited trauma maybe. And I think it goes further back than that because I think we've got Neanderthal DNA.
Maybe tissue memory. Is that it? But anyway, a lot of old craft was indoctrinated out of us because it's a power move, you know. It's like enclosures, you know, the enclosure of land and shipping people into the cities to work for the machine. It's That's all there. That's all recent history. Uh, yeah, I know some really good artists who work with the witch history in Fife.
I like what you said about the concept that witches were actually a purge on the neurodivergent. Um, we know that they were a purge on enforcing a extreme Christian morality as well, and so women tended to be um, tortured and killed because of perceived breaks to what the Bible said. Um, but I am absolutely certain that you're right, that a higher percentage than the population of witches, men and women that were burnt or tortured or buried or drowned or all these other horrible things that happened throughout Europe and this part of the nearest part of Asia um, are down to a higher percentage neurodivergent. Um, Whether I go along with the theory that trauma can be passed down the generations in genes or whether it's passed down by behaviours that go from one generation and learnt behaviours and learnt fears in oral tradition, in emotional passing on from mother to child, from father to child, I'm not sure about. But calling it a kind of ancient trauma in any kind of metaphor is fine, I think, because it is something that continues.
Yeah, I'm just wanting to say that I know that um, witch hunting still happens in countries around the world, and there may well still be people targeted. And I know from some readings in the past that there was a lot to do with the economy as well that affected um, the scapegoating of neurodivergent and single women and um, the demographic that were largely like accused of witchcraft because just there wasn't as much money I think to go around. I think there'd been famines at the time too, and so it's interesting to look at that and what comes up for us around security and money and being part of like a community.
I've got a few books on marginal experiences in history, and it's like a word came up like the Beguines. It's these women who went into kind of nunneries, not as an escape. It was like basically their only option in order to survive in certain parts of history and community. I think it's like 14th, 13th century, during the Dark Ages and during plagues and stuff. There was a kind of safety in these communities and they could have a relative independence without being ostracised or, as you say, scapegoated. Because scapegoat is one of these very primal things in human society. It's this third party identification for the other two to empower themselves, by picking on the other.
And that gives us this concept of othering that we use nowadays, putting people in the other group, and valuing them less to the degree so that you can kill them if they're your enemy in war, or subjugate them within a hierarchical structure, whether that be the business place or politics. It's all about dividing a group of people, and I absolutely fundamentally agree that neurodivergence has been one of those markers that puts you into the scapegoat group. But in an extreme way, I look at the kings and queens and the people with extreme power at different times in society, and they often seem to display to me versions of neurodivergence that aren't just the extreme end with the psychopaths. They are also just autistic people and people with brain injury, and they are people who have somehow managed to use the structures of society for their own benefit. Our own royal family is a group of inbred neurodivergent people. The Queen was autistic. They have, hidden members of families that are challenged in all kinds of ways. It does seem that autism is not just about scapegoating. Often we find a niche or a way around this, and through our ingenuity, we end up at the top end of things as well.
It gets just so deep into kind of, because then who's up and to whose end does the royal family like benefit? Who benefits from that? Because they're not the leaders of the country. They've not amassed power, and they're there because it must benefit the status quo in such a way that they're not. So it's like, I think often when the person who's the most visible person of an organization isn't necessarily going to be the most powerful one. Like I think if you were a really powerful organization, you would be choosing your front person really carefully based on what you wanted people to know or not know.
How we've ended up with a system that we've ended up is not a logical. It was not planned. It's developed over time, and some things have fallen away and some things have persisted. So for the royal family to continue existing at all with its great wealth means that it has survived through its strength. But ignoring things like royalty, I use that as an example because I think the idea that autistic people are always at the bad end of this shouldn't be emphasised too much, because I also believe that autistic people have demonstrated that their genes have given them some kind of advantage within the systems throughout history as well. So royalty is one way. It persisted because they had some advantage that they managed to keep it working. Business nowadays sometimes. So it's not always the autistic people that are at the bottom end of however the societal structure is at the time.
It just brings us back round to that intersectional idea of all these other aspects that matter as well. And you've got yeah, there's just so many overlays that it's not black or white.
We have somebody that wants to join the conversation from Podbeam, but we don't have a link for that at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll just put in the chat over on Podbeam a link whereby you can open that link in any browser and you can come and speak to us direct in our studio. So there's now a link in the chat on Podbeam. If you wanted to put that into your browser, you would be able to join us here. There's positives to this witch idea, isn't there, Nicola? Because
I believe so. I
yeah,
believe and I feel that the word witch it's almost it's reductive. I think that I've I think that the autistic brains can store information in such amazing, unique ways that there's so many autistic people that have got catalogues in their minds of mushrooms, mosses, like plants, um, the night sky, navigation. And I feel that that's part of the connection that we have um, to things that are consistent, that are reliable, that are kind of constant, steady, solid things. I know that that's one of the things that's helped me survive in this world is nature, and it's steadiness. Um, and these were the sorts of skills that people were persecuted for. And then when you look into even like the brewers, like the pointy hat that got associated with witches was associated with women brewers. Like women brewed a lot of beers because it kind of was connected with herbs, because you would use things like you've got hops, you can use loads of different bitter herbs for your beers and things. But that got taken up into the kind of patriarchal powers, as did medicine as well. So to think the wrong way, to think too witchy, um, would have been something that we'd have probably been teaching our kids to hide, eh?
yeah, it's I think it's something I hold on to as the positive part of my autism as an identity, and that's that I see, like you said, I see autistic people as sometimes holding skills or thoughts or openness or innovation in them. Like you said, if you are going to understand the science of botany and what is and isn't going to kill you, having a really good visual brain to be able to identify things works with some autistic people, or being able to remember and catalog things in a memory way fits with some autistic people. Also, having a different communication method might also put you into a place in a different world whereby you think deeply and think internally and spend an awful lot of time working things through in abstract ways. And that is something that fits an awful lot of different people as well. So, but then innovation is something that is always in conflict with the society that is already established. Doing something differently because an autistic person has worked out it would work better is always something that is fought against. So often autistic people find themselves as whistleblowers or as people who are ridiculed for new ideas, and it takes years until those ideas are recognised. You can think of all kinds of innovations in maths and science that autistic people worked hard on and over and stoically, and they didn't get recognised until eventually it comes through because there's a push against innovation.
It would be great to see shifts in society that meant more people follow their could have the time to follow their fascination or their kind of, how would you describe it, your fascination or your genius or your inspired path. There's a word, like an old word, the weird, your WIRD, and I think that's about your kind of destiny path. And it feels like if you were going to have a community where somebody's showing this interest and can go deep with it, because they say, does it not take 10,000 hours to become a master, to master a skill? Or I'm sure that must be much more fluid than that. It just seems a waste of, I don't know, it just seems a shame, a waste that that's not a priority.
What about what Raymond's saying in the text there? It's how we know these catalogue minds, how we experience them. It's been disabled. He describes these ways of being able to work with data and knowledge as memory palaces, like is written in Sherlock Holmes, perhaps. He's also saying it's more a sensory environmental relation and a repetition. I can't quite get to what Ray's saying there.
Yeah, I think that there's such plurality in the autistic experience that the way that we are going to make connections in our brain is going to be really different. Um, the memory palaces thing, like all my life, that's been an experience that like something that I've needed is that ability to kind of, it's almost like daydreaming, but it's more connected to reality because it's like almost like a learning place or a process, like a place where everything that I've experienced is getting processed. And if I don't get that time to kind of go there, I don't do very well. It's almost like, they say like if you don't sleep for a while, you'll unravel. For me, if I don't have that, um, yeah, like I'm going to say at that time in the memory palace or mind palace thing. I'm not sure how I feel about the phrase, but it's that space. I don't feel so good. And yeah, I find there's a lot of sensory connections. So I wonder if my experience of, yeah, I think I can understand the sensory stuff and repetition because I'm looking forward to seeing what he's going to say if I've understood it. But the repetition part, I think there's almost like a going over of all the kind of, for me, when I've gone off to my mind palace, it's like almost like a going over of all the things certain things that I know, and then comparing those facts. So I'm wondering what he'll say. I'll tune out. I'll go on mute now. The other thing I was wondering, oh,
I think I've understood something of what Ray's saying there. Repetition is never the same because things come in. So if you go over something, and I think some people call it overthinking. If you go over something, um, you don't just necessarily repeat the whole lot of the thought process because since you last did it, or even if that's only a few seconds ago, you've accessed some more bits of information that can add to that and that can actually change the direction. So for me, actually, the repetition and the going over things is a way of hammering away to end out at a different destination because something new comes in and pushes it in that direction. Um, the thing I'm getting to with what Ray is saying there about joyous flow is that for me, that period of repetition and banging away at things and moving through things until a new thing comes in and thing, it can be in different moods, and it can be in frustration, it can be in anxiety, and it can be in joyous flow. Like he's saying, it can be a lovely place to be where you are really feeling that you would call it a creative moment rather than banging yourself against a brick wall, and it feels as though probably the same thing is happening inside your head, but you're doing it with a different emotion. So it feels to me as though there are different ways of looking at this.
Right, and plug back in. Those tatties were dead good. Um, there's a cliche. If you walk over the same piece of ground constantly, it eventually becomes a path. But also mentioned repetition in connection with something Nicola was saying about, the 10,000 hours to become, say, skilled or proficient at, something. Um, the repeating of the thing makes it more familiar. And then again, familiar, there's a great word.
And it's hard to change these patterns. I set out to change a few things that I needed to change for my well-being um, in 2024, and I got to work with an OT for a wee while, which was really good. And I think it took me about 12 weeks to change like a pattern, like a habit of a lifetime. And it's like it's created big shifts. And that repetition has become so important. And now like I can't deviate from my new from my new more functional way. So that's quite good. I think that's a good thing about being quite truculent is that once I get in a good pattern I can do quite well.
Yeah, so I'm no expert, but it's kind of like energy, isn't it? It's like how to handle your energy. Um, what were you just saying there? It's gone. I'm in the flow. I'll just lie back a bit. Yeah, the word ritual came to mind when we talk about repetition and say habits and repeating activities. I mean needs. Some of them are necessary, um, and it's being aware of these things. So I see the word ritual come up a lot sometimes in things I'm reading and stuff like that about creating a space where you can carry out a set of actions that are enabling for you, uh, or able to expose you or open you up to a better energetic experience, say, and with the body, uh, rather than dominated by the mind. And finally, this wee space here on a Sunday, I see on those levels.
Most of the time, I don't think these Sunday chats are like that, though. You know, um, we've got really deep on the old philosophy here today, haven't we? And that's
Yeah.
because, I mean,
Don't
Ray
fear the
himself.
Reaper.
I think the thing is, it's not as droll a conversation as it must sound because we're muting out all the laughter. Like I've been chuckling away here in the background, but it's like I feel like when we speak, it just sounds so sincere, and it is
Yeah,
sincere. It is, but it's also there's a lot more like
nuance through
tongue-in-cheek
the
humor
laughter.
that
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, do
Well,
you know what I think?
there's a lot of experience here. It's a bit like a stoner's flat in 1984.
I would have been
You would have been what?
two.
Two?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ!
Oh
I
no,
was
my
17.
eighties, the eighties is definitely much more of a sort of rear view. Like it's something that I've known history of rather than remember that much of.
I
Just some,
probably I
yeah.
probably ate your rusks by accident.
Probably.
Good
Vitamin
God.
C.
You just used the word history over my childhood. Oh dear. I was 17 in those days, in that
But
historical time, and you were too.
yeah. I mean, my kids, though, they're, born in the 2010s. And so they laugh at me and talk about, well, that was back in the 1900s, mother, which sounds like really old now.
Wow.
Last
Okay.
century, yeah.
Yeah. Fucking last century when it means something. Yeah. Well, look, don't worry. I'll be dying soon. Um, I'm 59 years old, so that probably gives me 21 years of reasonably useful life, and then gaga for another 20.
Sometimes I'll look at my life as like, narrative tales, and so every decade has a theme or a current to it, and businessman was the last couple of decades. Well, decade, and the decade before that was carer, and the decade before that was activist. I won't tell you about the decade before that, which was probably the 80s. But the decade I'm going into now is probably called old guy in home. And I'm being quite humorous about that because there's ways you can work that one.
Yeah, I'm not willing to compartmentalize myself in the way that you've just done, but I know where I know I can access the feeling behind that. Um, if I just take the priorities of different decades, how does it go for me? It goes angry child and adolescent, followed by homeless and um, feeling entirely outside society for a short period. Then there was a period of business building and home building, and then there was a kind of semi-retirement, big house in the country, doing up a house, and then there's since the house burnt down. I think the next bit I'm getting into is moving away from generally working for a living and moving into really committing to Autistic Radio and Autistic Association as a big part of the next 10 years at least.
Yeah, they all sort of feed into each other. I've noticed that. You can't predict the future, but if in retrospect you can see how things happened. One thing flowed into another, but at the time you couldn't quite see it. Uh, well, you couldn't think it. It was happening anyway.
Just like when you're just living one day at a time, and then gradually this big picture. I'm just imagining big sand mandalas when we're talking, and it's kind of beautiful, really, like to think about all the different. There's been a lot of different changes in my life too. Like I got as far away as New Zealand, and at that time I would have gone to Mars. Um, and there was like beautiful memories all the way through, even in my homeless journey, with homeless time as well. Like it was it was the most painful. It maybe felt almost like painful like childhood, to be honest, but it was extremely painful. But I feel like I learned something from that that's like worth so much. Um, and in a way, like it left me, it helped me to get a real kind of balanced, I feel more fleshed out, realistic view of like our society as it is, and then how amazing it is when like people are actually loving and kind to each other. Um, all and Like I put all my energy at one point into like uni, and I managed to graduate really well and become like a nurse, and that's how I got to New Zealand. But like I was apart from that, there was nothing else apart from like a sleeping person, just an exhausted, in pain person who couldn't really relate. It would get to Friday after work, and I would be like, "Oh, what do I do now?" Luckily, I had nature, and I could kind of walk and do that. But it's yeah, I suppose it's zooming out. It seems a lot more beautiful.
Wow. What we've ended up doing here is telling survivor stories. You know, we're sharing um, survivor stories, and I suppose that's about bonding and as a group. You know, sharing autistic experience. Did you? Yeah, I did that. You know, did you end up in that situation? Yeah, I ended up in that situation. You know, survivor stories are, well, they're written by the survivors, aren't they? They're written by us. We fucking survived that, but there were lots of bits that we nearly didn't survive. And if you'd had a few more of me as twins, I think they would have probably crashed and died somehow. Um, so it's really weird when you get into past your 30s, maybe into your 40s, and as far as I've got, nearly into my 60s, and you look back on them and you say, right, those things are really important to me, those tough experiences, but they're the survivor stories, and other people shouldn't have to go through them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see, I look around and I see signs of there being a bit more of a safety net in place now for young people, than there was then. But it really, like you said, it's the survivor stories, and in a way, like I just saw a wee post a wee while ago, and it was talking about how at first they were making the mistake of looking at like the damage to planes that came back that had been shot at to try and like um make them more robust, until they realised like they really needed to look at the ones that didn't come back, to see where the vulnerabilities were. So yeah, like you said, they're survivor stories.
Or just not have wars.
Yes, quite. I feel like I find it quite difficult. I went to like a parents teachers group for like families with um additional support needs at the high school, and they were like the teachers were kind of telling us all about how they had a program where they were teaching everybody about autism, so um people would be able to understand. But like I pointed out that um while yeah, it was the double empathy issue wasn't being taught at school at all. It was very much a kind of one-way thing, and how autistic people needed to kind of like people just needed to understand, to give them a bit of grace, but they needed to like kind of almost, yeah, like, I can't remember. Sorry, I'll come back. This thought's got all jumbled in my brain, and I think I might need more tea.
I sometimes wonder what they're teaching kids in school about international relations in the media. Because when I was at school, they had a subject called Modern Studies. I wonder if they still have it, and it was very political, um, which is very conditioning as well. Um, but to understand the reality you're in, you have to understand the media that feeds you information about world affairs. Or are kids just living in the now? Now.
Well, from what I hear from Matty, the teachers seem to be doing quite a lot of countering online stuff as well. So they're doing a lot of trying to, I don't know, counter. I think Andrew Tate was a big one for a wee while. And yeah, just a lot of the kind of, yeah, the way
Fact
that
check.
yeah, all of that
Fact
stuff.
fact checking. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
my
policing almost.
a little bit at the same time. I think it's like I think that I don't think critical thinking like is something that goes too far, and I think looking at your sources and knowing where they're funded, uh, whose agenda they play to, is like quite a good thing to know. So, you know, they came back and they were looking at primary. They were like telling the difference between primary and secondary sources of information as well. So, I think that there's I think that there's lots to criticise. About like mainstream education, but I also think that there's a lot of like good, really solid, like people there who are genuinely want to equip kids with critical thinking skills and the ability to kind of see other perspectives. So it's I think I've heard from a lot of friends who don't have kids a lot of worry about what they're teaching kids at schools, but like from a parent firsthand, most of it's mm, it depends on the teacher. It does depend on the teacher, but there's a lot of good eggs there.
It's a while since my daughter was at school, but I do remember thinking when she was at school, she was born in 91, which means that she went schools through the schooling system in the 2010s, really, I suppose, up to 2010. And I was impressed by modern schooling. I thought it had progressed a long, long way since I was 11 in 1976 and leaving in 1981. The difference between leaving in 1981 and going on to university for her in the 2010s was really significantly different. But the problem is that the bombardment from the outside on social media and the misinformation and the sophistication you now need to have to be able to see through to the story, it's eluding the whole of our society. Hopefully the teachers are managing to create that critical thinking, and I'm sure they are better than they were in the 70s. But it seems like the wall of misinformation against people, it takes a lot of unpicking, and being very good at critical thinking for short periods of time, you're still being washed over it, you're still being advertised at, you're still being manipulated in your subconscious all the time when your critical thinking isn't there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's like even when we're watching a film and you're letting the story wash over you, and then if adverts are coming in, they're able to kind of access your brain in quite a receptive state, and the messaging so like again like they use repetition, like they know that the advertisers know that they want us to see things so many times. So I get a lot of targeted ads because I'm in my 40s for like um stuff to do with aging and wrinkles, and it's quite strange because it's not something that like I'm not somebody who's very bothered or interested in that stuff too, and to be confronted with like a woman who just looks like a woman, who's then I'm being told, oh, this woman's not acceptable. If you look like this woman, you're not an acceptable woman. Yeah, it's mean.
YouTube was such a cultural revolution when it first came out. It was like, wow, we can mediate ourselves now. We can set up our own on demand TV consumption. And then it just became like everything else. You know, if you don't subscribe, there's ads interrupting anything you watch on it, unless you go into some kind of bootleg app, you know.
Also, back to what we were saying about schools, one of the things that I've noticed, I've been in an adult learning environment, like locally, doing just doing some NQ, like national qualifications, like small practical things. I've been in classrooms with women who are, up to maybe their 60s, and I can really see like the trauma in older women, and it's something that I noticed when I was younger too, that people from kind of my parents' age up, they really have a fear around teachers and learning, that I think was kind of on its way out by the time I was at school. I had a few weirdo teachers, but generally there was a better culture. But then seeing the culture that my kids have gone into like school with, it is really different, and there's not that fear. And I do think it really helps people learn when they've not got like fear of physical punishment, or yeah, like going on at the same time.
There was also the fear of being judged if you were not quite capable of handling education. And it reminds me, I think I was talking about earlier about my primary one experience and my first arrival at school, is this sense of exposure you get, which can be quite, disturbing. Um, can lead to a few different things. You know, the way I compensated with that was to be what they call in autistic jargon a pleaser. You know, to please the teachers who were kind of like surrogate mothers. Anyway, I can't remember a male teacher until I was like maybe 15.
That's interesting because what you've done there, it seems to me, is parallel a male autistic experience, so the privileged experience of being a white male, but then drop down because you're autistic, so it's no longer as privileged as it was, with somebody who's describing previous generations of women who exhibit now a kind of trauma of a similar thing. So that seems like an interesting parallel that just happened there. Um, Nicola saying that she looks on previous generations of women and she can see what society has done to them, and you saying that you embody a level of trauma going back to the pleasing thing that comes from being autistic, and that attracts a level of experience that has trauma in it.
Yeah, but the pleasing also was a compensation thing. It's one of these many, many fronts. When I was talking about the decades, they were like fronts, narrative characters that you almost play in order to get through.
Yeah, I was trying to say that that's what women do, as a norm in our society, because women are masking to some extent, whether they're autistic or not. Well, obviously, we are all masking to some extent. It just depends how you define masking. But women are tending to put on a certain role for certain situations in a conformity that men aren't experiencing, expecting to the same extent. So there's a parallel there, it seems.
I think it sounds like it's a trauma. You can see that's a trauma response as well, and it's like it sounds like even the people who are able to kind of meet academic standard and please the teacher and be quiet and things, they still had that as a trauma. It was fear that kept them in line. And I think of like relatives of mine who really seem to me that they might meet criteria for things like dyslexia, like not into books and writing and things, but like absolutely incredible at visualizing things that they can build, like that real three-dimensional, um, practical skill there. Um, having been told that they were the dummies at school and being treated like that, and instead, and when they were sent to do like some outdoor education, they felt that they were just getting sent like away because they weren't good enough for school. And the difference I'm seeing in education now is that the kids aren't, they're not being shamed in that way, and there's a bit more respect to a spiky profile than there was before.
I'm wondering if kids today get the same feeling we had, which was that if you skived school or skipped school, it was an alternate reality. Now, I don't know, if maybe they enjoy school. You know, maybe it's like if they left school, what would they do? Just hang out in a cafe uptown or something?
I know my son would prefer to be homeschool. I think that's the thing is about the school environment. It's still for a lot of kids, it's still a really overstimulating place. It's hard to be there. And I find from a sensory perspective, like if I've got to walk through the playground to the reception, that's an overwhelming experience of like loads and loads of movement all around you with lots of high pitched screeching. It's really, really hard. So I think burnout is still definitely a thing for kids, but they're again, that's not something that's having to be masked, and I've been able, my kids been able to have negotiate a bit of a reduced timetable so that you can do some stuff at home, and that's really helped.
I'm not recommending skiving school, by the way.
Okay, guys, that's our hour for the drop-in up, and we're going to move to the 555 room, which means that some people in different places, particularly Podbeam, it's going to go quiet for a few seconds as we set up with a new recording.